Good morning, Upswell. It is so good to be with you today at this morning workshop session. My name is Angela Romans. Oh, please advance the slide. My name is Angela Romans, and I am the Executive Director of Innovation for Equity, and I'm the former Executive Director of AchieveMission, which just officially sunset, according to the state of Massachusetts, a few weeks ago. So I am very excited and humbled to be here today with my two colleagues who will introduce themselves in a minute to talk about the decision that we made to sunset our organization. And I think it's a really important conversation. In a study in March of 2021 by the philanthropy research group Candid and the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, it showed that over a third of nonprofit institutions, organizations in this country are at risk or maybe at risk of closing due to the pandemic. So we know that this is happening, and we know that it is important to talk about. And so we'd like to use our experience to shine a light on something that is an important part of the life cycle, a real part of the life cycle for so many nonprofit organizations. We'd like to hear who's in the room. We'll introduce ourselves in a minute, or my colleagues will introduce themselves in a minute, but we'd also love to know who's in the room as well. So we are going to put up a poll so that you can answer who you are, whether you're a nonprofit board member, or you are a nonprofit staff member, or other identities that you might have from philanthropy or other places in the social sector. So can we launch our poll, please, so that our participants can fill that out? Should be coming up in a minute. Well, while we are waiting for the poll, I'm going to hand it over to my colleagues to introduce themselves. So, Crystal, why don't you introduce yourself and then hand it over to Monisha?
Sure. Good morning, our Upswell colleagues and participants and friends. My name is Crystal Sewell. I am currently working with the Kreisky Foundation as the Director of Human Resources. And the former board chair. It's interesting when we say former, given the work that we've been doing with AchieveMission, but the former board chair for AchieveMission, and particularly the board chair during our dissolution. In addition, I have about 25 years of experience in nonprofit. I always stop at 25 because it's a little more than that, but I stop at 25 years working in nonprofits and sort of how we can serve community. And that gives you a little bit about my background. Monisha?
Hi, everyone. I am Monisha Kapila. My day job is as the founder and co-CEO at ProInspire. ProInspire is a nonprofit focused on supporting leaders at all levels to accelerate equity. And we do work with individuals, with organizations, and across the sector. I have been on the AchieveMission board. I was on the board for 6 years and served as board chair from 2019 to 2020, really kind of leading up to some of the transitions we made. Outside of AchieveMission, I've been involved with other boards and through ProInspire, where we have had to make decisions around sunsetting, spinning off, and merging programs. So I'm really passionate about this topic, and particularly the role that boards can play around it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Crystal and Monisha. And I'm not seeing our poll come up, so hopefully that will come up and we'll find out who is in the room in a minute. But until that happens, can you advance the slide, please? Excellent. So today, Crystal and Monisha teed up a little bit of this, but we given our story and given our journey together to sunset AchieveMission and through conversations about merger and other options, we want to talk through some of that with you and give you an idea of some of the thoughts, considerations that we went through when, and that boards and organizations like yours can go through in terms of considering what the next stage of your organizational life cycle might be. And then we'll talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of the dissolution. As one of our farmer colleagues said, all the steps. I wouldn't know all the steps if I had to sunset an organization. So we want to talk through some of that to give you an idea of the complexity of the process. And then Crystal will talk about implications, so what now what, and what we have learned and some of our thoughts and lessons for philanthropy and for the broader social sector field. So that's what we hope to accomplish today. And I'm going to hand it over to Monisha, and please advance the slide.
Yeah, so really our goal for this session is that that you'll leave with questions to help your board evaluate difficult organizational decisions such as sunset, merger, or strategy shift, and at least come into these conversations with a perspective of the different options that are available. But we also want to hear from you, and I see the poll results that 28% are in organizations considering a sunset or a merger. 14% were previously involved with sunset or mergers in other organizations. 14% are funders or consultants to orgs that are considering this, and 42% just want to learn more. So hopefully everyone in this group will leave with learning more. We do want to hear if there's any specific things. So we're going to put in a Menti, which is a link for you to open up and share what is something that you hope to learn from today's session. And I'm going to share the results from that. So we can go ahead and stop the slides. All right. So what are you interested in learning from today's session? We see one thing in here about what role do boards play in guiding a sunset? Great.
And Monisha, while you're waiting for more of the results to come up, I am actually curious about the folks who are consultants to organizations that are in the process of potentially investigating merger or sunset, and what those consultants might be learning from their work as well, that they can share in the chat or ask questions about in the Q&A. So that would be really interesting for me.
All right. What role do staff play? And I think we have some definitely key recommendations around that from our experience. Good, another minute, and then we're going to what the moment is when to finally sunset the organization. Yes, when you actually make that decision. Folks are just learning more. A grants consultant who hope for grants to save them, but that's not going to happen, and how to have these difficult conversations. Yeah, thank you for naming that. I think that part where so many organizations know they're in a crisis, but are hoping there'll be some answer out there. How do you decide where to place your intellectual capital? Great. When it is good to sunset, and what are next steps once you decide? The communication strategy and how you inform the community. I'm glad you asked that. We can definitely speak to that. And how do you do it in an equitable manner? Yes. All right. We can put the slides up. We're going to start just by giving some background on AchieveMission and what led the board to even consider this. So AchieveMission is a nonprofit and started as a consulting firm for other nonprofits and foundations in 2009, really focused on talent management services. And at that time, there really wasn't much happening in the nonprofit sector to support around questions about talent and leadership. About 9 years after the founding, the founder left. We had some interim leadership, and then there was a strategic shift in 2018, and I was part of the board that really supported that and promoted a new ED from within. Someone who had been at the organization for some time became the executive director, and under her leadership really decided to integrate talent management, adaptive leadership, and racial equity in the work that AchieveMission was doing. And as part of that, in 2019, we wanted to expand leadership, and Angela Romans came in as a new partner, and new board members, including Crystal, joined to really align with the strategy. At that time, one of the things that the board did do was look at some merger possibilities. AchieveMission's staff had been anywhere from 4 to 10 people over the history, and that had kind of presented some challenges about depending on the type of work that was coming in, it was hard to manage staffing. And so we looked at what would it be like to be part of a larger nonprofit or a nonprofit consulting group that might give some more consistency. But we didn't find any merger opportunities that really turned into something. And so, yeah, the organization, the leadership said, well, let's keep doing the work we're doing. It's important, it's valued. And then in 2020, COVID happened, and that was a huge impact on the organization because so much of the work was earned revenue from other nonprofits, and other nonprofits were facing crises. So they were really scaling back on the support that they could get from partners like AchieveMission. So the organization cut operational costs, reduced staff hours, delayed hiring, reduced contractors, pause discretionary expenses, many of the things that nonprofits were facing in spring of 2020 when everything abruptly came to a pause. Summer 2020 was this key organizational decision point. So that question that someone raised of when do you decide? And there was a forcing mechanism. The executive director actually found a new job and decided to leave the organization after about 7 years there. And Angela Romans, who was a partner, decided that she would be happy to be interim, but confirmed she wasn't interested in the permanent position. And so then the board had to figure out what's next. And I was board chair at that time, but we typically transition board leadership in July. And so Crystal was vice chair. And even though we were going through this crisis, Crystal still agreed it made sense for her to take the chair role. And so through all this transition happening, the board looked at options and decided to sunset. And so we'll share a little bit more about what we considered. And then through this year, Angela fortunately stayed as a consultant role to support the dissolution. And we've been able to transfer assets from the organization to 2 nonprofits, which we think is really important for how we can contribute to the work, and shared intellectual capital with the field. So we'll speak more about that. But if you can go to the next slide, we'll speak to what were some of the things that the board was considering when we had this key decision point in summer of 2020. The first was, how does the current context and environment impact the future of the organization? So we knew we were in a rapidly changing moment with COVID and the impacts on organizations, as well as the racial justice reckoning and the work that AchieveMission was doing around talent leadership and race equity. We knew that there was a need for that. But also, how can the organization best contribute to the field was a key question. Like, is a role what it was when AchieveMission started, which was to really be kind of one of the first organizations to be starting some of these practices, and what is the board capacity needed in each scenario? So if you go to the next slide, I'll share a little bit more about the different options that we considered using those 3 criteria. The first was a new ED search. And we said this is possible. We would need to find an ED really ready for a startup or a restart, because the organization was going through so much change, and it was a very small team. So it was going to have to be an ED who was ready to come into that kind of environment. And if we did that, then we could continue to grow the services work that AchieveMission was doing with new leadership. And the board capacity required this would be high. we would need the board to really step in to do a lot of work around the hiring process. We looked at the merger possibility. We thought that was challenging because AchieveMission had looked at merger possibilities 2 years prior, and they've been unsuccessful, and that was in a more stable environment. And so we thought, given 2020 was challenging for so many nonprofits, we didn't think that we'd see different results around a merger than we had a couple of years prior. We did think if we had pursued a merger, it could help us to grow the services work. So that was one benefit of a merger. But again, high capacity would be required from the board to identify the right partner. When we had looked at merger possibilities in the past, the former ED had really led that. And so with the former ED exiting, it was really a question of who was going to then be looking at merger if we did that. And finally was dissolution. And this is what we ultimately decided was the best option. The first was a feeling that we had a runway to sunset positively and contribute assets to others. So as we were making this decision, we knew there were enough resources, kind of money in the bank for AchieveMission to adequately support staff with transitioning out and have resources to be able to do the dissolution and have money that they could contribute to other organizations. And as we thought about contributions to the field, one of the benefits was there were a lot of new organizations doing work, particularly around racial equity. And there was a feeling from the board that AchieveMission could do one of these other options and try to find ways to grow it, or we could take these resources and support these newer groups who were doing this work and support them. And that we could share our intellectual resources broadly for the field. And the board capacity, we felt like this was probably medium capacity to move to dissolution. So that's ultimately what the board decided. And now I'm going to pass it to Angela to talk more what was involved with that.
Thank you, Manisha. Please advance the slide. So all the nuts and bolts, and knowing that our journey was only one of the possible, iterations of this process, still think that it would be great to share some of what we learned. And one of the things that I learned, being sort of closest to all the operational components of the dissolution and tasked with that and committed to that, were that there were 6 areas that I would say are important ones for consideration. And some people have asked about some of these in the mentee as well. So I'll start with communications, and someone asked about that. I mean, it was really important to be intentional, really important for the board, for myself, for other staff to be intentional about what we're communicating to whom and why. And an additional context, as Manisha said, our former executive director left the organization in the summer and took a wonderful new job. So we had just communicated out to the public that she was leaving and that I was taking over as the interim executive director, and that Crystal was taking over as the board chair. So there was a lot of celebration around this transition from the former leadership to the new leadership. And then we had to be very thoughtful about so what is it going to mean then when we end up needing to tell the world that actually we've decided to sunset? So that was some additional and important background context. So what we were very lucky to have an amazing communications professional on the board. She actually is the communications director, vice president for independent sector. So we were able to really leverage her expertise to help us think strategically about communication. Another thing, like I said, during this transition, and we communicated that there are 2 Black women now leading the organization, myself and Crystal. And in our communications, we said, look, what is it going to look like to the field when we've had sort of fanfare about 2 Black women leading the organization, and now the organization is sunsetting? And we really want to just take head on the potential implications for that. And we want to address that and shape the message around that so that it's not viewed as a deficit, but that it's viewed as a positive, as an asset for the organization, an asset for the field that we made this decision. So we did that, and then we decided to craft a communication that would address all of the, or what we thought was were all of the different components and the nuances that the board considered and Manisha talked about. And we wanted to do that in stages. So I started off communicating with our current clients, letting them know personally through a personal phone conversation or Zoom conversation, what was happening, how that would affect our role with them, see what questions they had, see also what they might want to learn and what they might want to gain from us in terms of our intellectual property. And I also had conversations with the staff, and those conversations were pretty varied depending on where the staff sat in the organization, how much the staff knew, how connected they were to the board and the decision-making processes of the board. So it was a little messy to have different kinds of conversations with different staff, but I think really necessary and personalized as well. And so talking about the staff, the board was very clear that they wanted to approach this process as a people with a people first mentality, a people first approach. And that was clear and intentional and very, very explicit by the board. So we as an organization knew that we would actually have some financial assets left at the end of our dissolution process. So we were able to think about, okay, what can we do for the staff that might be a little bit above and beyond what's in our current policies around severance, because we had the opportunity to do that. So that was a wonderful thing. But at in any way, depending on whatever your organization is left with, it's really important to let staff know what's happening and to be really clear and to over communicate to staff what's happening. So I was available, the board made themselves available to the staff. We wrote, gave staff written confirmation about what would be happening with their roles, what would be happening with their benefits, wanted to make sure that staff knew, for instance, hey, you have to use your FSA balance by July as opposed to before the end of the year. So that they, and if you're going to apply for unemployment, this is what it's going to take. This is what we know. Also, please seek out other counsel, legal counsel, board members could be available, et cetera, if staff had questions around that. And then I needed to end all of those benefits and talk with all of those different folks, the suppliers of our retirement benefits, of our health benefits, FSA, all of those, in order to end those accounts as the organization was dissolving. So all of those logistical and operational pieces. And then legal and financial, I mean, this is the piece that took the most time. And so want to, triple click on that, because the legal process is what took the longest. Like I said, the state of Massachusetts was the final authority in AchieveMission's dissolution. So we had to understand what different processes were in different states and what the state of Massachusetts, which is our incorporating state, designated as the process. We were able to get a pro bono lawyer to legal counsel to advise us through the process. And I cannot recommend this highly enough. Make sure that you have legal counsel throughout any process, a merger or dissolution or any other structural change. And they will help you to make sure you can comply with all the federal and state and local ordinances and filing processes, and make sure you're up to date with those. We found out that we were a little bit behind with some of our processes. It is pretty normal for nonprofits to do that, unfortunately. So just to be real. And if you're going through a structure change, all of that will catch up with you. So make sure you're up to date with all of those filings. And then we made sure that we were able to transfer the financial authority around our bank account and some of our other accounts to both our board chair and our board treasurer and myself, so that if someone had to leave during this process, we still had enough continuity so that one or two people could continue to maintain the important legal and financial authorities to continue with the process. And then finally, maybe I'll just double click on the intellectual property since someone asked about that. We, as Monisha said, making sure that we could share with the field was very important to the board and to the staff, and considering that AchieveMission had 11 years of intellectual property that our clients have really benefited from. So we decided to catalog, to understand, first of all, what is available, what's current, what would be helpful to the field. And then we researched different options for storing information, transferring it. Is it something that would be that we could monetize? Is it something that we would want to share with one organization or several organizations? And finally, we decided to share with the field. So if you actually go to AchieveMission's website, achievemission.org, you can see both our announcement, our communication around our sunsetting, as well as a vast wealth of resources around talent management and leadership development and DEI and racial equity that we decided to open source share with the field for the next year. So those should be available through March of 2021. And then I will just say quickly, we were able to transfer our financial assets to two organizations that are Black-led nonprofits, Black woman-led nonprofits that are doing work in racial equity and leadership development. And so we were really able to live our values completely through our process to the end of the organization by saying we want to center organizations that are mission aligned and that are centering Black leadership. So that was really exciting as well. All right. Well, there's much more I could say about the nuts and bolts, having lived the process over the next year, but I will pause and turn it over to Crystal to again talk about the so what, now what.
Next slide, please. Good morning. So what are the implications? We saw some of the questions in Minty about some of the items listed here, but I thought I would share a little bit about, how do we engage kind of funders? What's the role of the board? And what happens, in the field, right? What are some of the things that can happen in the field? So when we look at sort of funders and we think about support from funders, I think I saw a comment, I'll paraphrase it a bit about, a grant can't kind of move you out of dissolution oftentimes. And so for us, I think about funders in terms of working in philanthropy for 13 years, funders provide more than just money. And there may be other resources before you even move to the decision around dissolution that you can leverage with your funders. So think about things like non-financial support. So whether it's sort of access to networks and resources and alliances that you may have in the field with other partners, as you think about how you could strengthen, nonprofits play a big role in strengthening I would say nonprofits, but really some of the anchor institutions like an independent sector who may be able to help you with some of the technical resources or some of the guidance that you may need. They may be able to fund some of the research that's necessary in order to help nonprofits even begin to think about whether it's sunsetting or the merger or how you might manage or to make the decision. So the more well-rounded support from philanthropy is just very helpful because it's not just about those dollars. It is the additional kind of wraparound resources. And then the third part, philanthropy plays a significant role in using sort of voice and in using even the financial resources to really help nonprofits move towards racial and ethnic diversity. And so as you think about sort of when you're applying for grants or the resources in terms of the learning resources, I look at how philanthropy sponsors sort of training Within Kresge, for example, we did have a cohort where AchieveMission was a participant in a program. We brought cohorts of nonprofits, small nonprofits together on a rotational basis. And I believe ProInspire participated, AchieveMission participated, and it was really around this talent kind of framework and how we could help nonprofits really build kind of the racial and ethnic diversity in the field and with the talent within the field and in leadership. How do we do that? And more funders are beginning to do more and more of that, convenings and partnering and bringing nonprofits together as a resource for one another to really have an impact on the field. And we talked a little bit about some of the non-financial resources, but there may be resources available where we can build out the decision-making tree, helping nonprofits understand and to partner with other nonprofits to make the best decisions for their organizations. And again, being an alliance, if you have a funder that you partner with, build a relationship. So it's more than just requesting a grant and doing that virtually. This is about relationship building and understanding where you are as an organization, how you're fully supporting the field, or where your challenges may be. Funders really want to genuinely support you in serving your mission in community. And the best way to do that is to really build a strong partnership or relationship with your funder. And so as we move to boards, I think there are a couple questions about boards as well within the in the chat and some of the questions. First and foremost, you must care for your staff, right? I remember when this first happened, it was my first call to Angela, was like, what can we do for you? Because she was the person who we knew was going to sort of lead us through this dissolution. And what mattered to her and the rest of the staff mattered to us. That was our priority in this transition. In addition, how would this impact the clients we're currently serving? How can we sort of make this decision with sort of the field in mind, with our clients in mind? And I would say the third, the CEO engagement is just really a critical point. It's the engagement prior to this point. One of the things that we experience is, I think we didn't recognize or realize that the previous ED was really looking in a different direction for her career. And so part of what we learned is that as a board, you have to engage with your staff, you have to engage with your CEO, so that when it's time to make a decision, you will know and you're prepared, you've done your succession planning, you've thought this through. Because our first step was to ask Angela if she wanted to take on the ED role. I'm not sure if we shared that. I know we talked about we would do an ED search, but that was because part of our engagement with Angela, she had a whole different sort of career trajectory for herself. And so we were really faced with not really having succession in place for the organization. So CEO engagement is really critical in this process, and it's throughout the entire process. And then the capacity and commitment of the board. And we had, I can't remember the number of people on the board. I think we had about 8 people on the board. And this commitment, depending on the makeup of your board, one, I think it's always great to have a board member, maybe somebody retired who may have more capacity. We had the luxury of Angela, who could carry the bulk of the dissolution. Some nonprofits may not have that type of luxury that we have, but the capacity of the board matters during this time. So having someone who may have additional availability. I would also say the commitment of the board to see it through. We did experience where we had a handful of us really seeing through the final sort of dissolution process. And I'll say this, women carried the heavy lift in this process. So I would say when you join a board, commit to see it through in the good and the dissolution. And I would say the dissolution wasn't a bad decision. It was a difficult decision, but it was best for the field. And it was really best for the organization. And when we settled in that space, when we understood that this is what was best for the organization, this is what was best, this is how we could best serve the field, it was a really great feeling for us to know that it wasn't a bad thing. It was not a failure. It actually will have greater impact, positive impact in the field. So knowing to sort of do that is really important. And I think this was another question that came up, is understanding sort of the board need to understand the organization strategy. It needs to understand the field that the organization is in and the partners. We had the luxury of Monisha, who was also part of the field, to really help us as a board to understand the field, the partners, a deeper understanding of the organization strategy. So if you're an ED, or if you work in an organization, we just encourage you to think of ways to build this into your organization so you know this if you are moving towards sunsetting. And finally, I think the field, the biggest thing is to network, right? You got to have access to information. We have to make this type of information more available, because for us, we didn't necessarily see it highly visible, and we had to find our way, which is why it was so important for us to develop a case study and to participate in this Upswell conference, is to try to make this information available. And I would say ask questions, right? Network, ask questions, research sort of your anchor institutions like independent sector, board source, to really try and learn. If you do a lot of research, the information is available and out there, but I think if we can make it a little more visible and public, that would be helpful for nonprofits. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Angela as we navigate to the next phase, and we could probably advance the slide.
Yeah, thank you, Crystal. Actually, if you could drop the slides so that the audience can see us, let's do a little bit of Q&A, and there are a few questions in the chat. One question is about how we decided on the organizations to receive our financial assets. And I'll talk about that a little and then see what Crystal and Monisha would add. A couple things. One, the dissolution process in our state, Massachusetts, was really clear about some of the parameters. It had to be a nonprofit organization. It had to be mission aligned, so that an organization, doesn't give all of its money to the board's best friend's daughter or something. So it needed to be mission aligned. And given those parameters, we said, okay, who's out there doing work that AchieveMission is doing in the areas that are aligned to our mission, so talent management and racial equity and leadership development. So we actually had a consultant research possible organizations for us. And then the board had a meeting essentially and talked through the pluses and minuses of some of those organizations, some of the board's connections and experience with some of the organizations. And that's what ended up ultimately helping the board to decide. Like I said, we wanted to live our values. So again, we wanted it to be an organization, if possible, that was BIPOC led, and that was focusing on work that would impact BIPOC communities as well. What else?
One thing I would just add in that process, we also wanted to, Angela's point, make sure that it wasn't swayed by board members' personal interests. So for example, I recused myself from the decision-making on that because of a relationship I had with one of the options on there. So just also recognizing that, making sure you're not using board members' interests in that decision-making.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So something else that Crystal talked about, that we have talked about a lot in this process, is the equity consideration. Someone asked, how do you sunset an organization equitably? And we have like 25 pages of writing on that that we are hoping to share with the field. But in 2 minutes, what would you say was important? I mean, the intersection of race and gender came up a lot for us in this process. So what would you highlight for folks that were equity considerations in this process?
I can start. I think the two things that come up, one was just the fact that the board said we're going to be people-centered, and given the demographics of the AchieveMission staff, that meant being really cognizant of race and gender, of how the impacts on the people. It meant things like, how do we give people longer paid time periods to figure out what their next steps could be? And on things, I think, as you mentioned, of even as we communicated this, really wanting to communicate that part of the decision to sunset was listening to Black women, listening to Angela as interim ED and Crystal as board chair of what makes sense given the current context for the organization, and not saying like this is something that is because of what they did, but actually they've just stepped into this and said this is actually what makes sense. So those are, I think, some of the things that came up for me around how do we stay people-centered, and how do we listen to Black women of what they think is needed?
Yeah, I think, Monisha, you captured it. When you look at humanity and you center there, it really begins to help you to look at kind of equity from that standpoint. And I think our communications, right? How we sort of framed the decision, as I think Angela may have shared earlier, or Monisha have shared earlier, is that we were right on the cusp of Angela taking on an interim ED role, my taking on the board role, and then immediately we're saying, oh, and by the way, and we're sunsetting. And so we were very intentional about these being sort of a really good decision for the organization, and how we frame that communication as well.
Yeah, and I think it could have been even better if reflection, like I said, the intersection of race and gender came up a lot. So just to be real talk, the women on the board, our board had 7 members. The women on the board really stepped up and partnered with me in an active way in the process. The men on the board were much more passive. They did what was necessary in terms of showing up to board meetings, but did not go sort of the extra step. And we've been reflecting on that, and I think we could continue to reflect on that over some months. But that was an issue, and it's an issue that we reflected on, and I'm not sure we did as well as we could of addressing that with the men on the board to say, hey, where are you? Hey, this is the dynamic. What do you think about this? How can we address this? What do what's your commitment and accountability? So just as Crystal said already, but just to double underline it, when issues of people not showing up are happening, it's something that is important to name and to have conversations about, so that we can really have those hard conversations about where is the workload falling, and is it falling on folks and with identities that have traditionally been marginalized. So women, and largely women of color, were doing the work, and that's not a good thing. It got us through, but it wasn't equitable. All right, there is another question. Oh, Manish, you were going to say something else?
I saw this question about the timeline.
Yes, I was going to do that. Ask that one.
Yeah, so I can start with saying, I think this was, July 2020 when we had these transitions and started the board discussions about what would be next. And it was August 2020 when the board made the decision to sunset. But as Angela said, the final dissolution just completed in October 2021. So I don't know if, Angela, I think you would say about the timeline to be prepared for.
Yeah, it takes longer than you think. It was not quick. There was a lot of flurry of activity, and then wait on the legal process to happen, flurry of activity and wait for the legal process. So however long you think it will take, double that, just to prepare yourself for the process. All right. Well, I think we only have time for some final thoughts. So Crystal, Lanisha, maybe 30 seconds of a final thought for folks who are thinking about this process and going through it.
Yeah, I'll quickly go. I'll just say dissolution is not a failure if you need to sunset, but doing it well and doing it thoughtful with racial equity and care for staff and boards stepping up, I think is what's going to be key. And a lot of care for your executive director if that person has to like carry the load and finalize your dissolution. So.
I'll add that I think sunsetting, merging, strategic shifts are actually good things for the sector, and we should be encouraging it. I've been involved with multiple ones, and there's sort of this perception. I was like, oh, like, is that a bad thing that happened? And I think that's a sign of health, of us saying, like, when is something working in the current state, and when could it be better in a different state? So just want to encourage you, wherever role you're playing, to keep an open mind to that.
Excellent. And I will continue with the theme of life cycle, that this being a part of the life cycle of many organizations, and say that if you end up going through this process, you will learn lots of transferable skills. So I talked a lot in this process about being both a death doula in the AchieveMission process, and then now a birth doula in starting up another organization. And so I really feel like the two processes are complementary in a lot of different ways. And so you will make it through if you need to participate and lead this part of the life cycle of an organization, and you'll learn a lot in the process and add hopefully to the field. So thank you, all of you. If you could put up, if our tech person can put up the final slide, which is our contact information, so you know how to find us if you need to. Thank you all so much, Upswell community, and we look forward to continuing this conversation with you in the future. Thank you.